Friends, I'm hoping you can see on your screen a photo that I took. So you can see lots of old stone there, and that is the Roman Forum, right in the heart of Rome, as it was a couple of years ago. We have a saying, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. And I'm now going to try my medieval Latin. So are any of you professors of medieval Latin? You'll forgive my pronunciation. Si fueris Romae, Romano vivito more, si fueris alibi, vivito sicut ibi. That's apparently the medieval phrase, often shortened to when in Rome. Or a later version, when in Rome, do as the Pope does. And it's a proverb attributed to Saint Ambrose, apparently. The story goes that there was a Saint Monica and her son, Saint Augustine, and they discovered that Saturday was observed as a fast day in Rome when they planned to visit. However, it was not a fasting day where they lived in Milan. So they consulted with Saint Ambrose, and he said, "When I am here in Milan, I do not fast on Saturday. When in Rome, I do fast on Saturday." And that reply is said to have brought about the saying, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, which of course we know has become a saying meaning, when you visit a foreign place, observe their customs. Okay, I wonder if you recognise any of those pictures there. So for those of you who may be unfamiliar, the large photo on the left is the Trevi Fountain, always crowded with tourists and security. Then top right, you can see the River Tiber. And then the bottom right of your screen, you can see the Circus Maximus in the foreground, which is where they used to run chariot races, and the Palatine Hill in the background, which of course is where many of the senators had their houses, and the palace was there, and the Roman Forum just over the other side. Now, I visited Rome in 2019, and I found the city to be full of ancient monuments and modern tourists. It was filled with a cosmopolitan mix of people from all around the world who come each year to see the Colosseum, the Circus Maximus, the River Tigris, the famous Roman Forum and Palatine Hill, the triumphal arches. And there are, of course, numerous other things: aqueducts, baths, roads, both ancient and modern, the catacombs, and the Vatican, the seat of papal power for nearly 2 millennia. Some more photos for you here. So on the left, that's the National Roman Museum. I spent about a day there reading about the history of Rome and of Italy, and found it a fascinating place. So that's on your left. The top right of your screen is the remains of a Roman road. You can find them throughout the former Roman Empire. So you can see the flagstones there, very carefully laid, and they're 1500 plus years old, so they've really retained their evenness quite well. And then on the bottom right, you can just see the Colosseum in the background, and that's Constantine's triumphal arch in the foreground, which is another very famous arch that he would have marched through with his troops to celebrate his victories. So when I was in Rome, I needed to learn to get around. How did I ask for directions? How did I find food and accommodation? And it made me wonder about the Rome that Paul saw some 2,000 years ago as he entered the city along the Via Appia, passing the Forum of Appius and the 3 taverns, and heading for a rented house in the city. Some more of my photos here. These ones may be more familiar to some of you. On the left, you can see the juxtaposition of the ancient work of St. Peter's, so the beautiful decorations and stonework and a million tourists, and a very modern television for televising the Pope's addresses to the nations. Top right, you can climb up into the dome of St. Peter's and you can look down on the floor below, and where you can see the Latin there, Petrus et super hanc Petram, so it's about Peter. Jesus' words to Peter, "Thou art Peter, and on this rock I shall build my church," in Latin, those words. And all of that gold is tiny weeny little gold squares, and you can get up close to them, and they've all been painted. It's an amazingly intricate work. Then bottom right, of course, is a very famous shot looking from the top of the dome. So you can climb up to the top of the St. Peter's Dome, and there's a walkway, and photographing straight down onto the city of Rome itself. And we know that that courtyard there is often filled with chairs for people listening to a papal address. Which, of course, when I was in Rome, made me really wonder about the influence of the Roman Empire on the modern world, and especially on religion. What do people believe, and what has come from Rome? And I wondered about Rome as seen through the scriptures. So this series, I think it'll probably run to 2 parts, possibly more. This series will look at aspects of the Roman world as seen through the lens of the New Testament. I hope you take something from it. Okay, let's have a look at the Roman world in the times of the New Testament. So we're talking the 1st century after Jesus Christ. Now, by this stage, Rome had conquered vast pieces of what we now know as Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. So let's just have a quick look from left to right on the screen here. So if you go far left, I might just see if I can do a pointer here for you. Let's try this one. There we go. So you recognise here, this is modern day Spain and Portugal. This is all Roman territory in the 1st century AD. Then we move north to France and Germany and across Austria and so on. This is all Roman territory. Look up here. So much of Britain was conquered by the Romans up to Hadrian's Wall. So Scotland was never conquered by them. And then we come down, of course, through Italy and across east. So what's now sort of Eastern Europe and what was called Asia at the time, Asia being a bit further over, the Middle East. So you can see here all of what was Greece, Ephesus, Miletus. Paul's ministry was mostly in this area, of course, and then down as far as Jerusalem and the Middle East. And also Northern Africa was largely settled and conquered by the Romans. So it's a vast area. Note that the provinces attached to Rome and managed by the Senate. So they're the pink sections, as opposed to the ones actually managed by the emperor himself. So the little grey bit here is a client state where Rome's power would have been acknowledged, but they would have had independent rule, presumably, at that stage. Okay, so let's travel back in time, having looked at where we're talking about, and imagine ourselves in the Roman world in the time of the apostles. So this is the first decades after Christ's death and resurrection. And let's begin with what it meant to be a Roman citizen, something very important. Now, by the time of the birth of Jesus, the Roman Empire, as we've seen, had spread its influence and might all the way around the Mediterranean. That brought a degree of political stability to what we today know as Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. By this time, Roman citizens were no longer only those living in Rome, but they were spread far and wide throughout the ancient world. So, what did it mean to be a citizen of the Roman Empire? Well, that's a good question. Citizenship could be obtained in a number of ways and carried a number of benefits, one of which was clear and strong legal rights. For example, no Roman citizen could be punished or put to death without a proper trial from a recognised Roman authority. So Rome looked after its citizens and its amici, its friends, because this kept its rule strong and its jurisdiction relatively peaceful, while also boosting its potential military power. Rome's soldiers and armies were originally drafted from the people of the city of Rome, but later from the Roman provinces as well, which gave them enormous capacity to build military strength and maintain their power. Now, I'm sure you know that Paul and Silas were Roman citizens, a position which earned them much privilege and protection on their journeys. They used their privilege when they were arrested in Philippi. Let's have a look at those words from Acts chapter 16. When it was daylight, the magistrates sent their officers to the jailer with the orders, "Release those men." The jailer told Paul, "The magistrates have ordered that you and Silas be released. Now you can leave. Go in peace." But Paul said to the officers, "They beat us publicly without a trial, even though we are Roman citizens, and threw us into prison. And now do they want to get rid of us quietly? No. Let them come themselves and escort us out." The officers reported this to the magistrates, and when they heard that Paul and Silas were Roman citizens, they were alarmed. They came to appease them and escorted them from the prison, requesting them to leave the city. Remarkable story, isn't it? I find it interesting that on this and a number of other occasions, Paul stood up for his legal rights and insisted that the officers eat humble pie and come and personally escort them out of prison. This passage seems to me to be in stark contrast with others where Paul advised the churches to give way to those who wish to wrong them and even allow themselves to be shamed or cheated rather than making a public spectacle. And one example of that is recorded in 1 Corinthians 6, as we'll see a little bit later. Now, Paul was again arrested in Jerusalem, and he again used his privileged position to avoid punishment, and also, at the time, discussed his citizenship with the centurion who was present. As they stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "This man is a Roman citizen." The commander went to Paul and asked, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" "Yes, I am," he answered. And the commander said, "I had to pay a big price for my citizenship." "But I was born a citizen," Paul replied. Those who were about to question him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. So we see that Roman citizenship carried great privilege, and that when Jesus called Saul of Tarsus to service on the road to Damascus, he knew that Saul's legal status would be of great benefit to the dissemination of the gospel. Perhaps we could reflect on our own legal privileges and see how they might aid us in our Christian ministry. Many Christians in our world today do not enjoy the same freedoms or legal security that many of us enjoy in our Western liberal democracies. Now, the commander of the garrison in Jerusalem, Claudius Lysias, had presumably purchased his citizenship at great cost. A person born into a family of Roman citizens would automatically receive citizenship. Alternatively, if a man served in the Roman army and distinguished himself or rendered significant service to Rome, he may also have been granted citizenship. All others could sometimes buy citizenship if they had enough money and influence. Occasionally, those who rendered a substantial service to Rome were rewarded with citizenship. So we're not told exactly how or when Paul became a citizen, but the New International Version commentators note that by 171 BC, a large number of Jews were citizens of Tarsus, and in the time of Pompey, who was a Roman emperor, some of these could have received Roman citizenship as well. So it's possible that Paul's citizenship dates back before the time of Jesus, and he got it from his family. Now, we saw that Roman citizens could not be scourged. Scourging is to be flogged with a whip, which has got pieces of bone embedded in the thongs. Horrible torture. They couldn't be scourged, they couldn't be beaten with rods, and they could not be crucified. Hence, Paul was the ideal person to travel throughout the Roman world, bearing the precious gospel of Jesus. Just having a look at the picture on the screen there, see what you notice about the architecture. Obviously, it's the ruin, but you can see its grandeur, I hope. So this is the Roman Forum, which was the original site of the Senate and the law courts in the heart of Rome. And we see that the Roman legal system is the basis of our Western legal systems. So let's examine the Roman legal system for a few moments. Over time, a very detailed legal system was established by Rome. Roman rulers frequently took a census of the population in order to ensure that taxes and administration were adequate for each region. Now, in the New Testament, we read of tax collectors, such as Zacchaeus, who were generally hated by the population. And yet Jesus called them to follow him, including a tax collector known as Levi or Matthew, who was one of his first disciples, showing that Jesus did not judge individuals based on class, wealth, or position. Luke, while not a disciple, wrote about many highly specific aspects of the Roman legal system. For example, he gave a specific date for the census that was taken when Jesus was born. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to his own town to register. That's a passage we know well, isn't it? And historians can use verses such as this one to accurately trace dates and times, and so ascertain approximately when Jesus was born by comparing biblical verses with Roman historical records. Later in Luke, it is recorded that one of the key accusations made against Jesus during his trial before Pilate was that he was opposed to paying taxes to Caesar. Now, this emphasizes the power of Rome's laws and illustrates that the people were acutely aware of what the Romans valued. Now, once a region had been conquered by Rome, local governmental systems were established, including courts in the provinces which were overseen by Roman-appointed proconsuls. When Paul and Silas arrived in Ephesus, a riot ensued, and we read of the city clerk advising Demetrius and his guild members to press charges in the courts rather than being accused of rioting. If then Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a grievance against anybody, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. They can press charges. If there is anything further you want to bring up, it must be settled in a legal assembly. As it is, we are in danger of being charged with rioting because of today's events. In that case, we would not be able to account for this commotion since there is no reason for it. Thus spoke the clerk. And yet, by way of contrast, Paul counsels Christians not to take one another to court. Writing to the believers in Corinth, Paul criticises them. If any of you has a dispute with one another, dare he take it before the ungodly for judgment instead of before the saints? Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if you are to judge the world, are you not competent to judge trivial cases? Do you not know that we will judge angels? How much more the things of this life? Therefore, if you have disputes about such matters, appoint as judges even men of little account in the church. I say this to shame you. Is it possible that there is nobody among you wise enough to judge a dispute between believers? But instead, one brother goes to law against another, and this in front of unbelievers. The very fact that you have lawsuits among you means you have been completely defeated already. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be cheated? Instead, you yourselves cheat and do wrong, and you do this to your brothers. Strong words from Paul. So how does that relate to us in our Western liberal democracies? Well, we recognise that there may be times when others press charges against us or take us to court, despite our best endeavours at reconciliation. And I think there are Christians all over the world who are persecuted in this way. And it could happen to us too. But I think as Christians we should be peacemakers first and not be using the courts unless it proves absolutely unavoidable. When Paul was accused by the Jews of spreading disruptive teachings, they brought a lawyer with them to address Governor Felix, showing us another aspect of the Roman legal system, that of lawyers, legal counsel and advocacy. Let's read from Acts 24. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias went down to Caesarea with some of the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus, and they brought their charges against Paul before the governor. A short time later, when Festus took over rulership of Judea, he refused the Jews their request to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem and suggested that they should come to Caesarea to press charges. Let some of your leaders come to me and press charges against the man there, if he has done anything wrong, said Festus. Now once Caesar Augustus, whose name originally was Octavian, by the way, once he was recognised as the supreme power in the state, which was just a few years before the birth of Jesus, the practice of appealing to Caesar for a fair hearing, leniency, or an overturning of a sentence became common. Paul, addressing Festus, stated, "I am now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I have not done anything wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar," said Paul. A little later, Festus shared Paul's case with King Agrippa, acknowledging his right as a Roman citizen to defend himself. "I told them that it is not the Roman custom to hand over any man before he has faced his accusers and has had an opportunity to defend himself against their charges." And Agrippa also acknowledged Paul's legal right to appeal. Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar." It appears that Roman law also permitted the authorities to force people to perform certain services. Slavery was part and parcel of the ancient world, but Jesus alluded to a person being pressed into service during his Sermon on the Mount. And later, when he was being led away to be crucified, we read that a man named Simon was compelled by the soldiers to carry the cross. Let's read those two passages. So from Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said, "If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. And then in Matthew 27, as they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. So on your screen now, our next little subsection is languages, currency and taxes. So on the left you've got some Old Latin. On the top right you've got some silver coins, which we'll discuss. And on the bottom you've got a scale that's weighing the copper coins there. So you'll see why that's relevant shortly. So let's consider languages, currency and taxes of the Roman Empire. Members of the Roman Senate were usually fluent in both Latin and Greek by this stage of history. The Roman commander who arrested Paul in Jerusalem presumably spoke Latin but used Greek as his lingua franca, or his common language, to ensure clear communications. Koine was the Greek dialect used around the Adriatic, while Aramaic was spoken in Jerusalem and Galilee. So, Latin, Koine, Hebrew, Aramaic and Greek, 5 languages were all present during the time of the New Testament writings. We know that the Apostle Paul was educated at the feet of Gamaliel, who was a very famous rabbi, because Acts 22 verse 3 tells us. So he quite likely spoke Hebrew, although by this time the teachers of the law may have used the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, which was written in Koine, or Common Greek, not in Hebrew. Paul wrote his letters to the churches in Koine and presumably spoke Koine when interacting with the Roman soldiers. He certainly spoke Aramaic, and we have evidence of that in Acts chapter 21. As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the desert some time ago?" Paul answered, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." Having received the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic, "Brothers and sisters, listen now to my defence." And we know that they listened carefully once he started to speak Aramaic. It seems from history and from websites that I've read that Aramaic is an ancient Semitic language like Hebrew, which comes from the Aramaeans, hence its name, around the 11th century BC, and was spoken by Jesus and other Galileans. And I believe a version of it is still spoken today by communities of Chaldean Christians in Iraq and Syria, according to a website that I read. At the crucifixion, the official sign fixed to Jesus' cross was written in 4 languages. Do you know what they were? Let's read John chapter 19. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. I said 4 languages there, didn't I? That's 3. 1, 2, 3. Not sure what I did with my notes there. So Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. Okay, currency, of course, is money. And Roman and Greek coins were used and mentioned by the New Testament writers. We read of pennies, or asaria, copper coins, or lepta, drachma, minas, and the silver denarius, the standard Roman coin which a soldier received for a day's work. Jesus mentions the denarius in his parable of the Good Samaritan, in the parable of the workers in the vineyard, and when asked about paying taxes to Caesar, which is recorded in both Matthew and Mark. "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire men to work in his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard." And then the story of taxes to Caesar. Show me the coin used for paying the tax, said Jesus. They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, whose portrait is this, and whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then he said to them, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. The widow's mite, now that word mite is only in the King James, by the way, it was the smallest possible coin in currency, also called a lepta. It was probably a thin copper coin worth about 1/100th of a drachma, so not very much at all. We read that in Mark 12. But a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a fraction of a penny. Taxes were necessary to fund the Roman bureaucracy and to maintain law and order. Soldiers need to be paid. Tax collectors were despised by the Jews, yet Jesus associated with them, ate with them, and called Matthew, also known as Levi, as a disciple. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. Last subtopic then for the day is transport and communications. Now have a look at that aqueduct there, quite likely, 2,000 years old, and look at it, how solid it is. And they could probably plaster it over and get it working again if they needed to. Now, one of the great strengths of the Roman Empire was their ability to quickly move messages, troops, and goods over their excellent roads or around the Mediterranean by ship. Now, you think about this. They didn't have a mobile phone in their pocket. They didn't have satellites. How did they communicate between their different armies when they were spread over thousands of kilometres? Well, of course, they had to have the main roads beautiful, easy to travel in any weather, and they had to have them patrolled so that their messengers could safely speed along the main arteries out of the city of Rome and carry letters of instruction to Rome's armies and its administrators. And of course, that's what they did so successfully. And the peerless Roman engineering standards can still be seen today in the remains of ancient buildings, roads and aqueducts all the way around the Mediterranean. Quality transport and reliable communications also enabled the quick movement and dissemination of the gospel once it had been preached in Jerusalem. Transport by sea was common, but not undertaken in winter due to the danger of storms. And the usual sailing season by Jewish calculation lasted from Pentecost, May to June, through to Tabernacles, which was 5 days after the fast. The Romans considered sailing after September 15 doubtful, and after November 11 suicidal. When we reflect on the fact that November is right on the verge of the northern winter, we see how dangerous the decision was to continue sailing when Paul was being transported to Rome. I'm going to read from Acts 27. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because it now was after the fast, remembering that was their time marker for no more sailing. So Paul warned them, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our lives also. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbour was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. And we know, of course, if we read on, that Paul and all on the ship were shipwrecked, yet their lives were saved. Okay, what about religion? This is really important for us today. So picture yourself in Roman society of the 1st century. It was a polytheistic society. Poly meaning many, theistic meaning about God or gods, many gods. So they were comfortable acknowledging and worshipping many gods. They had their own stories about the rise of Rome, such as the legend of Romulus and Remus. But they had also happily adopted many Greek gods, as they slowly absorbed the Greek territories during their Mediterranean conquests. Therefore, they were prepared to acknowledge the God of the Jews and the Christians as yet another deity, as long as the practices of these new gods did not directly clash with Roman religious practices, as indeed happened from time to time. And there were periods when Roman leaders took a very harsh stance against other religions and sects. From time to time, Jews were harshly persecuted or driven out of Rome. At other times, Jews and later Christians were well tolerated, or Romans simply showed no interest in their beliefs and practices. When the Jews brought Paul to trial before Gallio in Acts chapter 18, he showed a lack of interest in matters of their law and turned a blind eye to the fighting that ensued when he ejected them from the court. Let's read that account. Just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to the Jews, "If you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanour or serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you. But since it involves questions about words and names and your own law, settle the matter yourselves. I will not be a judge of such things." So he had them ejected from the court. Then they all turned on Sosthenes, the synagogue ruler, and beat him in front of the court. But Gallio showed no concern whatsoever. Paul noted in Athens that the Athenians, who were then under Roman supervision, not Greek anymore, they worshipped many gods, and later Luke observed that the Alexandrian ship which carried them to Rome had the figurehead of the twin gods Castor and Pollux. Generally speaking, Roman leaders were instructed to allow the locals to govern themselves and worship their own gods, as long as those practices did not threaten Roman sovereignty. And as the Roman emperors became more powerful and autocratic over time, they were often proclaimed as gods after their deaths. We call that being deified, being made into a god, which over time led to the populace venerating the position of Caesar as a god. So they came to see Caesar as yet another god on earth. And this perhaps helps us to understand why the Jews consistently argued that Christians were trying to set up another god in opposition to Caesar. And why did they do that? Because it was a way to force the Roman governors to take action against first Jesus, then the apostles, and then the early church. The Romans, as we've seen, had many slaves, some of whom attained high positions of honour in government or within their households. It was possible, as Colin pointed out, for a slave to be freed, sometimes by his or her master, as thanks for good service, sometimes by earning enough money to purchase freedom. The New Testament often mentions slaves, and Paul gives slaves great comfort when he writes that they are spiritually free when they accept Christ. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. Although, if you can gain your freedom, do so. For he who was a slave when he was called by the Lord is the Lord's freedman. Similarly, he who was a free man when he was called is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves to men. Our modern Olympic Games, and we have the Winter Olympics on the TV at the moment, don't we? They have their origins in Greece. So back in 228 BC, Corinth, which at that time was under Greek control, admitted Roman athletes to their famous Isthmian Games for the first time, thus recognising Rome as part of the civilised world. So we're talking 200 years before Jesus. And this occurred during the transition of world power from Greece under Alexander to Rome under the emperors, or the Republic first and then the emperors. The original Isthmian Games included chariot races, horse races, pankration, which is some sort of martial arts, wrestling, musical and poetical contests in which women were allowed to compete, and boxing, so 6 main events. And as the games gained favour with and were adopted by the Romans, they were broadened to become large festivals often with gladiatorial contests. Prior to the participation in the games, athletes undertook strict training. Victors were originally crowned with dry wild celery, apparently, and later a pine wreath. So that's in the original games. Rome's festivals and games became huge public spectacles, held in order to celebrate special days, often including religious ceremonies, or to win the favour of the citizens. Emperors had huge stadiums and hippodromes built to entertain, amuse, and enthrall the people. Now you can see on the right there the underbelly of the Colosseum, and that's where they had animals and gladiators and all sorts of trainers and so on. So Paul made extensive references to aspects of Roman life in his letters. Festivals, triumphal marches and games, while common in Rome, were also adopted in the provinces where Paul was ministering. So when Rome enjoyed a victory over an enemy, the general and his legions were often acknowledged with a triumphal march into the city with slaves and prisoners in tow. At some of the Roman games, condemned prisoners were obliged to fight each other until only one remained, or to fight again and again until they were eventually killed. And when writing to the church in Corinth, Paul alludes to these customs. For it seems to me that God has put us apostles on display at the end of the procession, like men condemned to die in the arena. We have been made a spectacle to the whole universe, to angels as well as to men. And then a little later in the same letter, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore I do not run like a man running aimlessly. I do not fight like a man beating the air. In his letter to the Galatian churches, Paul briefly mentions the concept of running in a race and fearing that perhaps he had run his race in vain, suggesting that he had invested a lot of time and energy into learning and training for his ministry and was hoping it would produce a positive result. Let's read from Galatians 2:2. I went in response to a revelation and set before them the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles. But I did this privately to those who seemed to be leaders, for fear that I was running or had run my race in vain.